Some riddles stay buried. Others bloom again when no one's watching. But if there's one thing Miss Marple knows, evil has deep roots, and it never dies quietly. If you spotted the clues before she did, congratulations. But if not, there's always another mystery waiting. Consider hitting the subscribe button, turn on notification so you won't miss our daily Chapter 1. The Garden Beyond the Wall. Some gardens grow secrets too old to uproot. The carriage that had brought Miss Marple creaked its way up the final stretch of the drive toward Hawthorne Grange with a rhythm that echoed the passage of forgotten years. A slow, almost mournful progression, flanked by overgrown hedgerows and towering trees whose limbs seemed always to reach inward rather than out, as though shielding the estate from the world beyond its wrought iron gates. There was something peculiar about the air, even before the Grange came fully into view. Not quite oppressive, not immediately discomforting, but curious in its stillness, an absence of birdsong, a quiet too complete to feel entirely natural, as if nature itself had agreed upon a mutual silence with the house that lay ahead. Hawthorne Grange emerged from the last bend, like a memory rediscovered, partially shrouded in ivy and hesitation. It was a stately old thing, 3 stories high, with sharply pitched gables, narrow windows, like watching eyes, and stonework weathered by decades of Dorset wind and unspoken tension. It bore its lineage well, if not proudly, the sort of home that had long ago stopped inviting guests and instead tolerated them with a polite but weary acceptance. Miss Marple, despite her familiarity with such houses, so very English in their reticence, felt a flicker of something unfamiliar as she alighted from the carriage and looked toward the western edge of the property, where a high stone wall lay in ruinous peace beneath the shadow of a dying yew tree. Beyond that wall, she had been told, lay the rose garden. Once tended with obsessive care by the late Mrs. Hawthorne, it had fallen into neglect after her passing, left to be swallowed by weeds and bramble, the delicate order of roses giving way to nature's quiet reclaiming. It was strange, then, that Miss Marple should sense something watching from that direction, not movement, not noise, nothing as distinct as a figure or a sound, but a pull, a faint awareness, as though something behind the wall had shifted its attention toward her. Eliza Hawthorne greeted her at the front steps, thinner than Miss Marple remembered, with her once rich auburn hair pulled too tightly back, leaving her pale face exposed to both scrutiny and sun. Her smile was warm, yet carried with it the tremble of someone who smiled out of practice rather than joy. There was a fatigue in her eyes, but also something sharper, curiosity, perhaps, or calculation. "Jane," she said with breathless relief, taking both of Miss Marple's hands in her own. "You've no idea how glad I am to see a familiar face." "It's been too long, Eliza," Miss Marple replied gently, her gaze moving subtly over her old friend's shoulder to the darkened windows beyond. "And too far between letters. You'll forgive me, I hope. The house, it takes more than it gives." They shared a quiet laugh, but the words lingered longer than the laughter did. The house, indeed, did seem to take. Inside, the Grange was much as Miss Marple recalled, but dimmer, more sombre, its once proud corridors muted by dust and disuse. Paintings still lined the walls, tapestries hung untouched, but there was a hollowness in the atmosphere, as if rooms once filled with voices had chosen silence instead, and the silence had grown roots. They took tea in the drawing room, where the large bay window offered a view of the western lawn, and just beyond, the upper rim of the walled garden's crumbled archway. Eliza poured with steady hands, but Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers gripped the teapot a little too tightly, the way her gaze drifted more than once toward the garden she never mentioned. Finally, after a few polite exchanges, it was Miss Marple who broached the subject. "I remember the rose garden quite well," she said, lifting her cup. "You used to speak of it with such pride." Eliza froze for half a second, barely enough to catch, unless one had spent decades reading faces. "Ah yes, it was Mother's joy," she said at last too evenly. "After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to go there. Gardens are emotional things, aren't they?" Miss Marple nodded. "They remember, in their way, Some memories are best left alone, and there it was, not avoidance, but something heavier, not grief, either. Grief sits in the chest. This was lodged deeper. That evening, after supper had been taken, and the last of the house's scant servants retired to their quarters, Miss Marple wandered the halls under the pretense of reacquainting herself with the Grange. In truth, she was following a feeling, a gentle pressure, barely perceptible, that tugged her toward the western wing. This side of the house was colder, less used. She noted dust where there should have been polish, silence where one might expect the hum of activity. And then, from the end of the corridor, she saw it, a faint movement, too sudden to ignore, in the upper window of what appeared to be the old greenhouse annex. The greenhouse had been built by Eliza's grandfather, a gift to his wife, a sanctuary of sorts from the harsher world outside. Miss Marple recalled it dimly from her youth, a warm, humid place, filled with rare orchids and winding vines. It had long since fallen out of use, she'd been told. The windows were mostly clouded now, the panes streaked with years of neglect, and the door, as she soon confirmed, was locked. But someone, or something had moved behind that window. She stood quietly for a long moment, listening, not for footsteps, or voices, those would be too easy, but for changes in the air, in the tension of the silence. Nothing came, and yet, the feeling did not leave her. At breakfast the next morning, Eliza seemed more composed, her tone lighter, her demeanor almost cheerful. But Miss Marple noticed she wore long sleeves, despite the warmth, and a handkerchief tucked tight at her wrist. She asked no questions, merely listened, nodded, and made note of the way Eliza referred to the rose garden in the past tense, as though it no longer belonged to her, or to anyone living. Later that day, as the sun reached its highest point, Miss Marple ventured toward the garden itself. The path had once been lined with crushed gravel, now overtaken by moss and creeping weeds. The gate, once decorative wrought iron, was spotted with rust, and sat at a crooked angle. It groaned when she touched it, though not loudly enough to alert anyone inside the house. Beyond, the garden lay in strange quietude. Time had not simply passed here, it had settled. Rose bushes stood in rows, yet many were bare, their branches tangled and dry. Others bloomed unnaturally, full and red, though no gardener had touched them in years. It was not a garden, not anymore. It was a memory held in place, suspended, and unwilling to forget. Miss Marple walked its path slowly, pausing at each curve, her eyes drifting not only to the plants, but to the soil beneath them, to the arrangement of stones, to the subtle unevenness in the earth around the central fountain, now dry, its basin cracked. Something had happened here, not once, but many times, and the ground remembered each. Behind her, the greenhouse door creaked. She turned, sharply. The door remained closed, the window remained streaked, but still, she was certain, something had shifted. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. As she returned to the house, the wind picked up, soft but insistent, and for the briefest moment, she thought she heard it carry a name, lost to the trees caught in the leaves, but when she paused it had gone. Only the sound of her own breath remained. Inside, Eliza waited at the foot of the stairs, a letter in her hand, and her expression unreadable. "This arrived for you," she said, extending it. No name, no stamp, just left at the door. Miss Marple took it, noting the handwriting, elegant, feminine, unfamiliar. She opened it slowly. Only 3 words were written inside. "Don't trust Eliza." She looked up. Eliza had already turned away, and just outside the window, behind the walled garden, a shadow moved again. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. If you found yourself drawn in, dear viewer, then consider joining Miss Marple for what lies ahead. Subscribe to the channel, and stay with us as the mystery deepens, the garden remembers, and the truth begins to rise through the soil like something never quite buried. Chapter 2. The Whisper in the Thorns. The following morning dawned without ceremony. The light arrived shyly through a slate-coloured sky, barely breaking through the gauze of low-lying mist that clung to the edges of the garden and crept along the eastern corridors of Hawthorne Grange like a quiet, waiting thought. Miss Marple, who had slept little, rose early and dressed by lamplight, her fingers steady as they fastened buttons and tied ribbons, her mind turning with a quiet persistence, not unlike the gears of the house's grandfather clock, hidden behind a panel in the vestibule wall, ticking away behind silence, always counting. She had slept with the letter beneath her pillow, not from superstition, but instinct, as though proximity to the message might allow her some understanding of its purpose during sleep, though dreams offered no such clarity. The letter still rested upon her bureau, its 3 words as jarring in their simplicity as they had been the night before. Don't trust Eliza, no return address, no signature, no hint of handwriting that might betray its author, and yet it had found its way to her hands with unerring precision. One might say it had been meant to find her. She did not dwell on it, not yet, but tucked it into the pages of a book she had brought for light reading, and made her way down the stairs, her tread as light as ever, her thoughts wrapped around subtle questions without clear beginnings. There were voices already, low and strained, rising like smoke from the direction of the garden. At first, Miss Marple mistook them for the usual stirrings of the household, the clatter of trays, the murmur of early conversation, but something in their tone struck her as off, urgent without volume, like a kettle not whistling, but steaming nonetheless. She followed the sound, not quickly, but with a practiced calm that allowed her to notice what others might not. The mud on the foyer tiles, fresh, reddish-brown, tracked in thin, stumbling lines, the half-buttoned coat hastily abandoned on the hall chair, and the faint, sharp scent of something metallic carried in with the morning air. The scent of earth, certainly, but tinged with something more unsettling. She reached the garden's edge, just as the gardener was lifted onto the bench beneath the weathered sundial, 2 footmen holding him under the arms, their brows knitted with confusion and alarm. His name was Lennox, a man in his 40s, with shoulders like oaks and fingers made for pruning rather than penmanship. He was rarely heard, save for the humming that accompanied his work, a hum that had, until now, always struck Miss Marple as curiously soothing. But this morning, he was not humming. He was muttering, his clothes were torn, his arms scratched in a web of crimson lines, as though he'd stumbled headlong into a patch of bramble, or something worse. His eyes were open, but unfocused, shifting as if trying to see through fog, and his lips repeated the same words over and over, barely more than a breath. She was there, in black, she said. My name, she said. My name. No one knew what to make of it. The housemaid fetched water. Eliza came out in a rust-coloured shawl, and took one look before turning away, face pale, mouth drawn into a tight line. It was Miss Marple who stepped closer, watching the gardener with the soft gaze of someone who understood more than she admitted. She bent slightly, just enough to catch his next whisper. The woman in the roses, she's back. She never left. That was when the photograph changed. Later that day, in the drawing room, after the gardener had been brought indoors and seen to by the local physician, who had no diagnosis, save for exhaustion, and perhaps a touch of the nerves, Miss Marple stood before the mantelpiece, her eyes fixed not on the fire, nor on the tea cooling beside her, but on a silver-framed photograph that had hung there for as long as she could remember. It was a family portrait, taken perhaps 20 years prior. Eliza, her younger sister, and their mother, seated in the garden under the summer sun, roses in full bloom behind them. Only now, the younger sister, Camilla, was gone, not faded, not damaged, gone. The space where she had once sat was now empty, the background filled in, as though she had never been there at all. Miss Marple leaned forward, blinking slowly, checking for signs of trickery or misprint. But no, there were no signs of tampering, no scratches, no smudges, no glue or fading light. It was as though the photograph had simply remade itself. She did not mention it aloud, not yet. Instead, she tucked the frame into her handbag and replaced it with a similar-sized portrait from another shelf, a young Eliza, standing stiffly beside her mother, in a pressed white dress. No one noticed the switch. The original, she would examine later, in private, perhaps under lamplight and a magnifying glass. Photographs do not change, not on their own. Yet, here was proof to the contrary. The afternoon passed under a haze of unease. Lennox remained in bed, silent now, though his eyes refused to close. The servants whispered, and the sun did not shine. Despite the lack of clouds, the birds remained absent, the trees stood still. It was just after tea, when Eliza's niece, Clara, appeared in the sitting room, with an expression that hovered uneasily between petulance and fear. She was 16, willful, with a sharp chin and eyes that rarely met those of her elders. Miss Marple had taken little interest in her thus far, finding the girl evasive and too modern in her speech. But now, she stood by the window, arms wrapped tight across her chest, staring toward the garden with a stillness that did not suit her. "You saw something," Miss Marple said simply, not looking up from her knitting. Clara flinched. It was nothing, a shadow maybe. We're all entitled to shadows, but not all of them move on their own." Clara turned, then visibly uncertain. "It was near the greenhouse. I saw someone, a woman, just standing there. I thought maybe it was Aunt Eliza at first, but then she stepped back, and I saw her face. Only it wasn't a face, or it was, but not right." "And what did you do?" "Ran." "Did she follow?" "No," Clara said. Then, after a pause, "But I think she was already inside the house when I got back." Miss Marple looked up now, her hand still. "Why do you say that?" Clara swallowed. The grandfather clock started ticking again. It hasn't in years. The rest of the evening was quiet in the way that moments before a storm are quiet, expectant, taut. The household settled into its nightly routines, though no one seemed to move naturally. Each step, each spoken word, carried the weight of distraction. Miss Marple, after placing the altered photograph carefully into the small drawer of her bedside table, lit a candle, and sat in her room, listening, to the wind, to the soft creak of floorboards, to the house itself. It was near midnight when she heard it, a sound, muffled but clear, threading its way through the stone and plaster and ivy-covered walls, a cry, short and sharp, quickly stifled, but impossible to mistake for anything else. Not imagination, not a bird, or a door, or the moaning wind, a human voice. She rose, immediately, her step swift but careful, candle in hand, through the hallway, past the gallery of watchful portraits, and down the main staircase. She moved toward the west wing, where the ivy clung thickest to the outer wall, its dense green clutching the very bricks like fingers unwilling to let go. The cry had come from there, near the greenhouse. She was sure of it. Outside, the night was still, no moon, no stars. The garden path was damp, the scent of wet soil, rich in the air. As she approached the greenhouse, she slowed. The door was shut, the windows clouded, nothing moved. Then again, just beneath the sound of her own breath, a rustling, like fabric brushing against foliage, followed by something softer, a whisper. She turned toward the ivy-covered wall, stepped closer. A third sound, this time, not a cry, but a sigh, long and low, exhaled from behind the thorns. She reached out, her hand brushing the ivy aside, and what she saw. Chapter 3. Voices from the greenhouse. It began with the ivy, a slow creeping suspicion wrapped in green, as if the very plants that covered Hawthorne Grange were listening, breathing, waiting. Miss Marple had stood in the garden long enough to know the sounds of natural things, the sigh of breeze in leaves, the crumple of a dry rose petal beneath one's foot. But the sound she'd heard the night before, the cry behind the ivy-covered wall, did not belong to any plant or beast or wind. It had been unmistakably human, and unmistakably near. The morning brought no answers. Eliza did not ask where Miss Marple had gone after supper, nor did she explain why the greenhouse, long sealed, supposedly, had appeared to be shut from within. Breakfast passed with the clatter of cutlery and little conversation, and the air in the room hung thick with something unsaid. Eliza's eyes were shadowed, her fingers restless, her tea untouched. Clara, the girl, said nothing at all, and Lennox the gardener had not emerged from his room. Miss Marple knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. That morning, she allowed the silence to gather, to settle, to confirm what she already suspected. Whatever had been seen or heard was not going to be volunteered by anyone else, which meant it fell to her to see it for herself. By late afternoon, when the shadows stretched long across the garden, and the air cooled with the kind of suddenness that made one check for storm clouds, Miss Marple returned to the greenhouse. The path was damp, the grass brushing against her ankles, as she moved with quiet determination toward the structure at the far edge of the property, its glass panes streaked with grime, and its iron frame mottled with rust. The door, she found, was locked, but the old sort of lock, one easily coaxed open by patient hands, and a well-placed hairpin, or in her case, a fine crochet hook, which she kept in her pocket for mending, or occasionally, improvisation. The door yielded with a reluctant creak. Inside, the air was still, the heat pressing down like a weight on her shoulders, and the scent was not of plant life, but of rot. Roses had once bloomed here, exotic ones. Eliza's grandfather had insisted on them, varietals from Persia, from Algeria, from gardens whose names were whispered in Victorian journals. But what remained now were long dead vines, collapsed onto themselves like tired limbs, and brown petals clinging stubbornly to cracked stems. The ground was damp in patches, dry in others, as if the earth beneath had grown confused about whether it was time to live or decay. Cobwebs stretched like forgotten curtains across the support beams, and something shifted slightly in the far corner as she moved. A glint of colour, red against green. She moved closer. There, beneath a collapsed potting shelf, half buried in soil and rotting leaves, lay a single glove, canvas, the sort worn by gardeners, but not untouched. The fabric was stained deep crimson at the fingertips, as if it had grasped something sharp, something too difficult to release. It was folded, unnaturally, not dropped in haste, but placed, deliberately. Miss Marple picked it up with care, examined it, turned it over. No initials, no label, but unmistakably blood. She tucked it into her bag, replacing it with a cracked clay pot, so the absence would not be noticed too soon, and turned to leave. But as she did, she noticed something else. On the far wall of the greenhouse, mostly hidden beneath hanging ivy that had broken through the glass, were markings, faint, as though scratched or etched by uncertain hands. They weren't letters, not fully, but they formed shapes, repetitive, looping, symbols. She traced one with her gloved finger, feeling the indentation in the wood. Then from somewhere behind her, a soft creak, like a footstep. She turned, slowly. No one was there. Back inside the house, the tension had grown. Eliza, who once moved through the Grange with that elegant glide of someone who knows each board and stone by heart, now flinched at her own reflection in the window, recoiled at distant sounds, stared too long into empty corners. When Miss Marple mentioned casually that she'd been to the greenhouse, Eliza did not respond with surprise or irritation, but with something closer to fear. "It shouldn't be opened," she said quietly, her voice almost lost beneath the crackling of the fireplace. "Why not?" Eliza looked at her, and for a moment her composure slipped. "Because it remembers." Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet. That evening, as the sky turned bruise purple, and the house slipped into uneasy hush, Miss Marple asked to see the library. It was there, she suspected, that she might find something useful. Old journals, guest books, letters perhaps. Eliza allowed it, but with reluctance, and left her with a single lamp lit low on the writing desk. The journals were dusty, brittle, and mostly dull. Weather logs, planting schedules, occasional notations in elegant script about bloom patterns or imported bulbs. But one entry, dated nearly 30 years prior, caught her attention. February 14th. "The roses will not grow without it." Her blood, her name, the ritual. It must be done correctly. Never again by the hand of a stranger. No signature, no explanation. She read it twice, then carefully folded the page, and slid it between the pages of her notebook. The next morning, she made her way through the village, ostensibly to post a letter, but in truth to ask questions. She was known there, and well regarded enough, that a few gentle inquiries yielded conversation. At the baker's, an old woman remembered something. A story, a warning. "It's cursed, that garden," she whispered, wrapping Miss Marple's scone in brown paper. "Been that way since the first Hawthorne brought back seeds from Africa, said they were sacred, but they never told the truth about what they had to give in return. Women vanish, you know. Every few decades, a niece, a maid, always someone young, always around the garden. Miss Marple said little, but listened closely. By the time she returned, the air around the Grange had cooled sharply, though no storm had passed. The sky was clear, the birds were still absent. She made her way to her room, passing the long hall that led to the west wing. There, in the mirror that hung above the hallway console, she caught sight of herself, or at least she thought she did. But her reflection was not alone. Beside her stood a woman, dark-clad, motionless, face turned just slightly away. Miss Marple turned instantly, yet found herself alone. When she looked again, the mirror reflected nothing but her own face. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. That night, Eliza did not come down for dinner. Clara said she had taken to her room, refused company. Lennox remained in his, silent. Miss Marple walked the halls, listening. The floor creaked beneath her steps. The lamps flickered without breeze. In the greenhouse, the glove had vanished, and the markings on the wall had grown deeper. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 4. A letter never sent. The days had begun to lose their shape at Hawthorne Grange. Morning and afternoon slid quietly into one another, unpunctuated by anything save the flickering hesitation of light between clouds or the soft rustle of ivy tapping at the windows like fingers too polite to knock. Meals passed uneaten, clocks ticked off rhythm, and the house, once a vessel of proud order and inherited grace, had softened into a kind of reverie, uneasy, unbroken, and watching. Miss Marple kept her observations to herself, but her pace had quickened, her eyes more sharply attuned to the margins of things. The faint imprints on stair dust, the shape of shadow just too long beneath a lamp, the subtle change in Clara's tone when she spoke of her aunt, or the pause in Eliza's speech whenever the past brushed too close. And it was on one of these quiet, untimed mornings, when she found herself in the east drawing-room, where few visitors were ever received, and fewer residents ever lingered, that Miss Marple opened the drawer of an escritoire, not dusted in weeks, and uncovered something unexpected, something half-destroyed, and more than half intended to be forgotten. The envelope was scorched at the edges, its seal broken by time or intent, its contents partially blackened and brittle, but some of the ink had survived, ragged lines in a hand she had not seen in many years, but recognized nonetheless. Geoffrey Hawthorne, Eliza's late husband, whose name had scarcely been spoken since his untimely passing a decade earlier. She unfolded the pages with care, finding most of the writing obliterated, save for one stretch midway through the second page, its handwriting uneven, slanted, as though written in haste or fear. I should not have gone into the greenhouse again, but I had to be sure. The symbols match the ones in her journal, and the roots, my God, the roots are not natural. I heard them under the floorboards. It's buried beneath the lady's red rose. The line ended there. The rest was ash. Miss Marple sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. The lady's red rose. She knew the bush. It had stood for years, just beyond the broken fountain, at the center of the garden, its name carved into the slate stone marker by the base. It had not bloomed in at least 5 years. Others around it grew thick, some even unnaturally vibrant, as if stealing life from their more modest neighbors. But the lady's red rose had withered, its petals blackening early each season, its thorns brittle, its scent lost. She folded the letter and placed it into her handbag beside the blood-stained glove from the greenhouse, then stood and made her way toward the garden. The air outside was still, too still. She followed the overgrown path, past the hedges now yellowing at the edges, past the sundial where Lennox had been found, past the trellis that Clara refused to walk beneath anymore. The lady's red rose stood as it always had, slumped, tired, the ground beneath it hard and dry. But as she knelt before it, brushing aside some fallen leaves, she noticed something new, a ring of disturbed soil, barely visible, as though the earth had been carefully turned, and then smoothed again. She reached forward, fingers brushing against the base of the bush, and felt it, metal faintly cool, not round like a coin or the edge of a pot, but something finer, narrower. She dug gently, removing the top layer of soil, uncovering old roots that twisted in odd, looping shapes, not how roses grew, not how anything grew, not quite. And then she paused, sensing a vibration in the air, the kind that seemed to emanate not from the ground, but from the memory within it. She touched the metal again. It moved slightly under her hand. Before she could dig further, a scream shattered the quiet. It came from the house, from one of the maids. Miss Marple rose swiftly, her movements precise, unhurried, only by virtue of discipline. She followed the sound, back through the garden gate, down the hallway lined with portraits that now seemed to lean ever so slightly inward, as though listening. She found the maid in the drawing room, kneeling beside a scatter of disturbed soil upon the floor, her apron soiled, her eyes wide and wet. In her hand, trembling like a leaf clinging to a winter branch, she held a locket, gold, oval, engraved with a tiny rose. It had been found, she said in gasps, in the pot beside the lady's red rose. She had been tending the indoor plants, following Miss Marple's request to check the soil for signs of mildew. She had thought to use some of the garden dirt, believing it richer. When she brought the small shovel back to the house, she found the locket tangled in the roots of her harvest, as though it had clung to the soil and come unwillingly. Miss Marple took it gently from her, examined the locket's worn surface, its delicate clasp. It opened with a click. Inside, 2 portraits. One, unmistakably Eliza. The other, she stared. The face was young, unfamiliar at first, but then a spark of memory. An old photograph, long ago packed away. Eliza's sister, Camilla. The one whose image had vanished from the portrait above the hearth. The one who had, according to local whispers, disappeared without a word. The one Eliza claimed had married abroad. The one no one ever mentioned again, but behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. That evening, Eliza did not appear at dinner. Clara sat silently, her food untouched, her gaze fixed on the darkening window, where the rose garden could be seen only faintly, its shape outlined by the moonlight. Lennox had not stirred in 2 days. Miss Marple retired early, but not to sleep. She sat at her desk, the letter and the locket before her, the glove now wrapped carefully in muslin. The wind outside shifted direction. The portraits in the hallway, she checked them once more. Camilla's image had not returned, and the mirror in the corridor. She looked again. It reflected her, and someone just behind. She turned. The hallway was empty. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 5. The Missing Niece. The morning began, as it often did now, in silence. Not the natural quiet of an estate set apart from the bustle of village life, but something deeper, heavier, a silence that did not simply occur, but was placed, as if the house itself had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. The wind did not stir. The clocks no longer chimed. And when Miss Marple stepped into the hallway from her bedroom that morning, she felt at once that the air had changed. There was a hollowness to it, a kind of stillness that suggested something had shifted, not dramatically, not violently, but precisely. Clara was not at breakfast. There was no call for alarm at first. Young girls often slept late, especially in unfamiliar surroundings, and Clara had not been sleeping well. The dark circles beneath her eyes had deepened over the past few days, her speech more clipped, her glances toward windows and doorways growing more frequent, as if each sound in the hallway demanded her attention. But there was something more to it now. Eliza, already seated at the end of the long table in a robe too fine for the hour, and hands unmoving beside a plate she had not touched, seemed to know Clara would not be joining them. She did not ask, nor did she pretend to wonder. Her lips were thin, her tea untouched. When Miss Marple inquired, casually at first, Eliza responded only with a glance, sharp but hollow. "She hasn't come down," she said, and nothing more. Miss Marple set down her spoon, stood, and made her way upstairs. The corridor outside Clara's room was colder than the others, the windows here catching less of the morning sun though today there was no sun to be caught, only a haze of pale grey light that made the walls appear faded, the carpeting dull. Clara's door was closed. Miss Marple knocked gently. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She turned the knob and entered. The room, at first glance, appeared untouched. The bed was unmade, but not dishevelled, as though its occupant had risen without haste. The curtains were drawn but not fully, just enough to allow that strange thin light to fall across the writing desk by the window, where a few notebooks lay open, a pen resting askew atop a blank page. The wardrobe doors were half open. The mirror above the wash basin was slightly smudged, and then she saw it. Scratches, not on the outer sill, where one might expect the signs of wear from weather or time, but on the inside of the window, deep, jagged, unmistakably made from within. 4 long streaks, descending, as though from a hand or hands, clawed against the pane in some silent plea. Miss Marple stepped closer, her breath catching slightly as she studied the marks. They were fresh, not dust-covered, not smoothed by time. The edges of the wood still curled outward in tiny splinters. She looked at the bed again, the sheets pulled back, as though the girl had risen early or been taken. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass or spilled ink, but the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. She descended the stairs once more, finding Eliza exactly where she had left her, sitting stiffly, her posture unchanged, the tea now cold beside her. She did not look up as Miss Marple approached. "She's not in her room," Miss Marple said quietly. "I know," Eliza replied. There was a pause. "When did you last see her?" Eliza's hands moved slightly, fingers brushing one another, as if searching for memory. "Last night, at supper. She went to bed early. She said nothing strange, did nothing unusual." Eliza looked up now, and in her eyes, Miss Marple saw not confusion or fear, but resignation. She said the rose garden hums at night, that she could hear it, beneath her window. "Did you believe her?" Eliza's gaze did not waver. "I never disbelieved her." It was a curious answer, and Miss Marple stored it away, saying nothing more. Instead, she turned and moved through the house, retracing the girl's steps, or what she imagined them to be. From her room to the stairwell, from the stairwell, perhaps to the west corridor, past the old nursery, the shuttered guest room, and finally to the landing, where the large family portrait hung, 3 figures, seated in a garden much as it had been many years ago, before the greenhouse had been sealed, and the fountain cracked, and the lady's red rose had lost its bloom. The figures in the portrait had been unchanged for decades. Eliza, on the left, Camilla on the right, and their mother seated between them. Eliza's expression was as it had always been, composed, reserved. Camilla's had been joyful, almost mischievous, but now, something was different. Camilla was facing away, her body remained, seated in the same place, wearing the same dress, her hair arranged in the same curls. But her face, where once there had been a smile, there was now only the back of her head, turned sharply to the left, her gaze directed not toward the viewer, but toward something outside the frame. Miss Marple stepped closer, heart suddenly very still. This was not a new painting, not a replacement, not an illusion of light. The oil had shifted, the canvas had changed. Paintings do not move, yet here was proof that they did. She looked back down the corridor, toward the mirror that hung near the stairs. In it, she saw herself, and again, that brief impression of movement, just beyond. A flicker, like breath against glass. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 6. The Hawthorne Curse. By the time the frost settled upon the last of the late autumn roses and the morning air began to sharpen at the edges, there were things the house would not tell her. Secrets so old they had woven themselves into the stone, beneath floorboards, in attic beams, in the very silence that threaded each hallway like a forgotten song. But the village, quiet and tucked away beyond the hedgerows and barley fields, might yet speak. She had learned long ago that stories travel differently there, passed from mouth to mouth, polished by repetition, protected by belief, and sometimes just sometimes, steeped in truths that had been exiled from polite conversation. She waited until midday, when the sun, though faint, offered a little warmth, and when Eliza, after hours of pacing and unread letters, finally shut herself inside the library and requested not to be disturbed. Clara's absence had left her oddly subdued, not broken, not tearful, but blank, as if she had already accounted for this loss long ago and had simply filed it away for future recollection. There was no alarm raised, no police called, just an unspoken, hovering acceptance. And that, Miss Marple found, was more troubling than panic. The village, a small constellation of white brick cottages, slate roofs, and curling lanes, greeted her with a politeness that held a touch of reserve. Miss Marple was not a stranger. She had visited often in her younger years, but her presence now, under such circumstances, would of course draw quiet speculation. A few offered curt nods, a baker's boy tipped his cap. At the post office, she inquired about the weather and the state of the road toward Farncombe. At the greengrocer's, she commented on the apples, bruised earlier than expected for the season. But it was at the lace shop, where Miss Bramley still kept her father's ledgers and served tea with her gossip, that the conversation began to shift. "It's not your first time at the Grange, is it, Miss Marple?" the older woman asked, her hands wrapped around her teacup, more for comfort than warmth. "You were close with Mrs. Eliza's mother, if I recall." Miss Marple nodded, sipping. "We were girls together once. She had a fondness for puzzles, loved anagrams. And the roses, of course, always her pride." There was a pause. The air between them stiffened slightly, like a curtain stirred by a draught no one felt. "Still tending them?" Miss Bramley asked. "No. They've gone wild. Some bloom when they shouldn't. One has stopped altogether." Miss Bramley made a sound low in her throat. "They say it always starts with the roses. When the garden turns strange." Miss Marple set her teacup down. "They, the old families, the ones who remember, they won't go near the Grange now. Not for years, not since the last one disappeared." "And who was that?" Alice, maid to Eliza's aunt, the younger Hawthorne girl, "that was in 05, or near enough. She was 16. Same age as that niece, isn't she?" "She is," Miss Marple replied softly. Miss Bramley leaned forward, her voice lowered. "Every 20 years, near as anyone can tell, one girl, always young, always connected to the family, and always somehow tied to that garden. And they're never found, never, vanish clean as breath. Not a trace, not a cry, just gone. And the garden always blooms too bright, or not at all." The teacups sat untouched. Outside, the wind had risen slightly, pushing dried leaves across the cobblestones. Inside, time seemed to slow. "Did you know," Miss Bramley added, "that the old gardener, Eliza's grandfather, kept a journal, all in Latin, nonsense mostly, but some say it had records, names, dates. One entry even said the roses had to be fed." "Fed what?" Miss Bramley didn't answer, only looked at her with eyes gone distant, cloudy with years, and something else, something heavier. When Miss Marple returned to the Grange, the house greeted her as it always had, with stillness, with the faint scent of old wood and long extinguished fires, and with the peculiar awareness that whatever had changed was not finished yet. She moved quietly, through the hall, past the study, and paused at the landing, where the portrait of the three women hung. And there, without ceremony, she saw it. The eyes moved. It was not dramatic, not theatrical. There was no blinking, no shifting head. But as Miss Marple watched, still composed and precise, she saw the painted gaze of the mother in the center of the portrait tilt just slightly, enough that where it had once stared eternally outward, it now looked not at her, but at something behind her. She turned slowly. Nothing was there. She looked back. The eyes had not returned, and yet she felt their weight. Miss Marple did not cry out. Instead, she continued along the corridor, stepping deliberately into the library, where Eliza sat by the window, a book open on her lap, and a fire that had long gone out smouldering in the grate. "Clara is not the first," Miss Marple said. Eliza's hands gripped the pages, "and not, perhaps, the last. I thought," Eliza began, her voice thin, "if I kept them away, If I locked the door, if I burned the records, it would stop. But it doesn't stop, does it? Eliza turned to face her now, her expression raw. They made a promise, long before I was born. My great-grandmother, perhaps before even her. Something about the land, about what it gave in return, and the cost. A girl. Every generation. So the roses bloom, so the house endures, so the name survives. Miss Marple said nothing. There was nothing in that moment to say. Later, when the lamps were lit, and the house prepared itself again for its long uneasy sleep, Miss Marple passed again beneath the portrait. The mother still stared askew, her gaze fixed now not behind, but downward, toward the far end of the corridor, toward Clara's room. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If you've stayed with Miss Marple this far, consider subscribing. The mystery has only just begun to turn toward its deepest shadow, and nothing ahead is quite what it seems. Chapter 7. The House with Two Shadows. The clocks had stopped again, all of them. The mantel clock in the drawing room, the grandfather clock in the hallway, the delicate brass travel clock on Miss Marple's bedside table, all silenced, arrested at different moments of the previous evening, as though each had decided independently to abandon the task of marking time within the walls of Hawthorne Grange. It was the sort of detail that one might overlook in the blur of morning routines. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime noticing what others did not, found the frozen dials peculiar, more than peculiar. Telling time, it seemed, had no further interest in this house. She rose and dressed without ceremony. Outside, the fog had returned, not as a blanket, but as a kind of veil, thin enough to see through, but thick enough to suggest that nothing seen through it was quite to be trusted. The garden had gone grey. The grass no longer gleamed with dew, but lay flat and tired. The roses once again were in bloom where they ought not to be, and in the greenhouse, yes, that was where she must go next. But first, the hallway. Miss Marple left her room, the floorboards soft underfoot, and stepped into the upper corridor. The light was low, filtered by heavy drapes and the mist outside, and yet she paused, struck by something she could not name. It was not sound, nor scent, nor even the sensation of being watched, though that had not left her for some time, but something simpler, the play of light. She stood there a moment, still as any portrait, and looked down at her feet. Two shadows, both clearly cast, both extending behind her, one long and upright, her own unmistakable form, and beside it, another, shorter, leaner, not attached to anything, and not moving. She turned. The corridor was empty. She looked back, only one shadow now, and so she moved, not hurriedly, but purposefully, through the hall, down the staircase where the portraits had begun to seem less like decoration, and more like participants, and into the servants' corridor, where she had not been since the gardener had first fallen ill. Lennox had taken to his quarters, quietly. There had been no sound from within. The physician had been and gone. Eliza had said little. Clara remained missing. She knocked once, no reply. She knocked again, still nothing. And then, without further hesitation, she opened the door. The air was cold, not stale, cold as though a draught had entered and refused to leave. Lennox lay on the bed, covered, eyes closed, unmoving. A tray of untouched food rested on the small table beside him. His boots were neatly placed at the foot of the bed. Miss Marple stepped closer. No breath, no movement. She touched his wrist. Cold. There was no struggle, no sign of distress, just the stillness of someone who had ceased to be, as quietly as one might finish a thought and lay it to rest. Miss Marple did not cry out. She withdrew from the room, closed the door behind her, and made her way back to the main corridor. The house did not change. The hallway did not stir. The silence remained. Later, when Eliza was informed, she said only, "I knew it would come for someone again," and nothing more. By dusk, the fog had lifted slightly, and Miss Marple found herself in the library once again, searching not for comfort, but for proof. It came in the form of a slim volume, hidden behind a row of histories, a diary, small and leather-bound, its clasp broken, and its first few pages torn. The handwriting was faint, uneven. Most of it was mundane. Observations of weather, growth charts for the roses, notes about soil acidity, but tucked between entries, one line, in different ink. The rose feeds on the blood of lies. There was no context, no explanation. Just that single sentence, scrawled like a warning or a confession. She read it again, and then she folded the page inward, slid the book into her coat, and made her way to the greenhouse. The path was quieter now, as though even the wind had tired of stirring the grass. The greenhouse stood ahead, glass dull with dirt, the iron frame trembling faintly, though there was no breeze. She entered. The scent had changed. Not rot, not growth, something older. She stepped carefully across the stones, past the fallen shelves and shattered pots, past the rusted tools and collapsed vines, and reached the far wall. The symbols were still there, etched deeper now, as though scraped again in recent days, and then she felt it beneath her foot, a shift. Hollow. She stepped back, crouched, brushed away the moss and debris, and saw it, a line, a seam, a trap door. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 8. What lies beneath the handle was old. Its iron ring rusted to a stubborn stiffness, and as Miss Marple wrapped her gloved fingers around it, she felt, not resistance, but reluctance, as though the thing had not been meant to be opened again. Not for many years, perhaps not ever. Yet it moved, slowly, with a long, low groan that carried through the stone base of the greenhouse floor, like breath exhaled from beneath the earth itself. Reluctant and resentful, the air that escaped carrying a mustiness that clung to memory more than to sense, damp, sweet, and faintly metallic, like wilted flowers left too long in stagnant water. She pulled the trapdoor back fully and held her candle near the opening. A narrow wooden staircase descended into the dark, each step warped and sagging at the edges, and below, only more shadow. But Miss Marple had not come this far to stop now. She secured her shawl, steadied the candle, and began her descent. The space beneath the greenhouse was not a cellar, not in any traditional sense. It had no stone walls, no shelves for storage or racks of wine. It was more a cavity carved into the earth, shored with old beams, blackened by age, the floor packed hard with soil that had never seen light. Roots snaked across the ceiling, like veins. The candlelight flickered with each step, casting long, restless silhouettes that seemed to move just a moment before or after she did. The air was cooler here, but not cold. It pulsed faintly with warmth, not of life, but of something older, deeper, less definable. At the bottom of the stairs, the space widened slightly. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her shoes crunching softly against the packed dirt, past the detritus of old gardening tools left to rust decades ago. Broken pots, whose edges were now more moss than clay, and what appeared to be fragments of wax and charred paper, remnants, perhaps, of rituals once carried out in this forgotten hollow. She paused near the back wall. Something about the symmetry of the place unsettled her. It was too deliberate, too carefully shaped. There had been thought here, purpose. She felt it in the way the roots were cleared from the center of the room, but clustered along the walls like silent observers. Then, her foot struck something hard. She knelt, brushing the dirt aside with the sleeve of her coat. Beneath the surface lay wood, smooth, aged, a box. No lock remained, only a latch long rusted through. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside, swaddled in rotting linen, was a strange collection, items with no clear relation, save for their careful arrangement. A child's ribbon, frayed at both ends and stained with something brown. A silver comb, its teeth uneven and dulled. A pair of shoes, too small for an adult and worn through at the soles. A photograph, faded, the face distorted by mildew, but still discernible. Camilla Hawthorne. She was younger here than in the portrait upstairs. Her expression was unguarded, her gaze calm but unblinking. It was a photograph, taken not in joy, but in obligation. It seemed to ask a question Miss Marple could not yet answer. Beside it lay a notebook, thin, bound in worn leather. She opened it. The ink had bled in places, but much of the writing remained legible. A woman's hand, looping and tight. I've seen her again, by the fountain, where the ivy grows too fast. Eliza says I'm imagining things, but she never comes near the garden after dark. It calls to me, in dreams, not words, just knowing. They made a pact, grandmother. Eliza knows. The rose must be fed. She closed the book slowly, her breath shallow. The candle flickered more fiercely now, casting the shadows into sharper angles. She turned, and in that moment, saw it. Another box, smaller, set into the floor itself. She crouched again, hesitated, then opened it. There was only one thing inside. A locket, the same design as the one found days earlier, but this one unopened. Miss Marple gently pried it open. 2 images, Eliza and Camilla, together, smiling, in a frame of pressed dried roses, except there was something wrong with Camilla's face. Not a flaw in the photograph, but a scratch, deliberate, etched by something sharp across her eyes. A movement caught her attention. She turned. The wall of roots had shifted, not physically, not in sound or form, but in posture, like a crowd leaning forward in silence, watching. The light from her candle dimmed. She stood quickly, journal clutched in one hand, the other reaching for the beam above her head. A sound behind her, soft, like fabric brushing stone. Nothing, and yet she knew. She was not alone. She moved back toward the staircase, her movements calm, controlled, as though to avoid drawing attention. She reached the bottom step, turned once more, and in the flickering light, saw etched on the wall in what looked like ink, or blood, 4 words she had not noticed before. The rose remembers everything. She ascended, back into the greenhouse, back into the muted light. She closed the trap door, brushed the dust from her coat. She took the journal to her room, placing it beside the letter from Geoffrey and the photograph of the vanished portrait. That night, the air inside the house turned colder, though the fire was stoked well. The portraits in the hallway all seemed to lean slightly forward. The roses outside bloomed redder than before. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 9. The Poisoned Bloom. The rose garden had always been a place of contradictions, vivid and withered, lush and hollow, blooming when it shouldn't, and wilting when it should not have. Miss Marple, having spent nearly every hour since her arrival sensing a tension in the air around Hawthorne Grange that was deeper than silence and older than fear, now knew with cold certainty that it was not merely the past that haunted this estate, but the roots themselves. And so, by the grey light of morning, beneath skies, still bruised with cloud and sorrow, she returned to the garden, not with romantic reminiscence, but with intention. The roses, at a glance, were beautiful, too beautiful. Their petals, in shades of red, too deep and too vivid to be natural for this time of year, opened with theatrical grace, exuding a scent that clung to the air just a moment longer than it should have, as if reluctant to release its grip. She knelt by the lady's red rose and examined the soil beneath it. The ground, though it had not rained in days, was damp. The roots ran too shallow, then vanished. She brushed more earth aside, and found, to her surprise, fragments of glass, green, fine, broken like old medicinal vials. She lifted one shard, glinting like a secret in her palm. The soil around it held a faint, chalky texture. She sniffed, ever so cautiously, and caught the faintest trace of bitterness. It was familiar, though she had not smelled it in decades, not since a case in Devon, years before, involving a garden, a grieving widow, and a most peculiar tonic. That case had ended with no arrest, no confession, only a gravestone, and a new kind of silence in a once lively house. She remembered the scent, belladonna. Not enough to end a life, but enough to change the color of petals, the behavior of insects, the chemistry of a garden. Not enough to be noticed, unless one knew what to look for. She rose slowly, her knees stiff with the damp, her breath thin in the chilly air. The rosebush gave no protest as she stepped back, but its scent followed her, stubborn and sweet. The garden was silent, save for the faint rustle of something behind the hedge, perhaps a fox, perhaps not. Miss Marple returned to the house with her findings nestled in her pocket. In the drawing room, she found Eliza alone, staring into the hearth where no fire had yet been lit. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, unmoving, as though bracing for a storm. "Eliza," she said calmly, brushing a bit of soil from her coat. "What do you use to fertilize the roses?" Eliza blinked, then turned. Her expression betrayed nothing. "Why do you ask?" "The color," Miss Marple replied. "And the scent. They're too strong for November." Eliza was silent. Miss Marple continued, "And the soil smells of belladonna." The silence thickened. Eliza's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her fingers moved slightly, as though reflexively reaching for something invisible. A defense, a lie, a forgotten truth. "Perhaps," Eliza said at last, her voice low, "my great-aunt's journals are still somewhere in the west attic. She experimented. Before the trial. She was accused of poisoning her sister's fiancé. They never proved it, of course, but they buried her away quietly."
The Hawthorne poisoner.
Miss Marple murmured. "I remember now. It made the London papers, but they never connected her to this house. She lived here, until the day she disappeared," Eliza replied. "And her roses always bloomed in winter." The silence that followed was not quite empty. It was watching. Miss Marple left the drawing room and climbed to the attic. The stairs groaned like old lungs. The door creaked open into a room filled with trunks and hat boxes, dust motes hanging thick in the dim light. She found the journals in a velvet-lined box, marked only with a rose pressed into its cover. Inside, handwritten pages detailed the cultivation of hybrid roses using alkaloid compounds, carefully diluted. There were mentions of bloodroot, wolfsbane, foxglove. It wasn't gardening, it was alchemy.
One entry read,
"The bloom must come through suffering. A perfect rose demands tribute, not water, not sun, something deeper." The notes detailed rituals of root pruning done by moonlight, of strange murmured words, of ashes mixed with lye and bone meal.
One passage had been underlined twice.
"Only truth can bloom without poison. But who among us has lived without lies?" Another page contained sketches, diagrams of roots spreading like veins beneath the greenhouse, connecting to marks on the foundation stones.
There were symbols beside each drawing. Ian in her cane.
Miss Marple copied one into her notebook. She read on, through entries that grew less scientific and more obsessive. One journal described voices heard beneath the soil, whispering through the roots. Another recounted a dream, in which a rose opened to reveal an eye that did not blink. The final pages ended in uneven scrawl. "I have fed it enough. It remembers, it always remembers." Miss Marple closed the journal and looked out the attic window. The garden below looked no less beautiful, but now, she saw it not as a place of growth, but of consumption. The beauty had a cost, and she suspected it was measured not only in soil and sun. She returned to her room and laid the journal beside the locket, the letters, the diary, from beneath the greenhouse. Each clue was a petal, and she was drawing ever closer to the heart of the rose. But then, in the late afternoon light, something caught her eye. Movement, in the garden. She rose, moved to the window, and saw her, Clara, standing amidst the roses, looking up at the house. Her presence in the garden was not loud or dramatic. It was the stillness of her form, the precise way she stood amidst the thorns and shadows, that sent something cold into Miss Marple's chest. Clara was motionless, as though she had been planted there alongside the roses. Her arms hung unnaturally at her sides, and her eyes were fixed on the window above, as if she had known precisely where Miss Marple would be standing. There was no scream, no cry of joy or concern, only silence, and in that silence, the weight of something long buried, pressing slowly up through the earth. Miss Marple moved. Her steps were swift, but measured, down the creaking staircase, through the chilled corridor, past the darkened mirror that now showed two reflections where there should be one, though she did not stop to confirm it. The garden door opened with a groan, and cold air met her like breath from a forgotten crypt. She stepped outside. Clara remained. The roses trembled faintly in the wind, though Clara's figure did not move at all. It was the way her dress moved, too lightly, too slowly, as if the air passed through her rather than around her, that made Miss Marple pause. Her instinct was to call out, but something older than reason, something rooted in every instinct of observation she had honed over a lifetime, kept her silent. Instead, she watched. Clara's skin, now seen closer, was as pale as the ash of old letters. Her hands bore the slight marks of soil beneath the fingernails. Her shoes, the ones she had worn the evening she disappeared, were muddied and scuffed, though the paths between the garden and the forest had been dry for days. And then Clara turned her head. Not quickly, not naturally. It was as though the motion passed first through her shoulders, and then reluctantly into her neck, until her eyes met Miss Marple's, and held. There was no recognition there, no light of familiarity, only vacancy, and behind that, something else, something watching from behind her gaze. "Eliza," Miss Marple called, her voice firm, but not panicked. "Eliza, come quickly." The door behind her remained closed. The wind had stilled. When she turned back, Clara was gone. Not fled, not run, nor darted, simply vanished, like smoke into fog. The spot where she had stood showed no imprint on the soil, no broken rose, no displaced leaf. Only the scent remained, stronger now, cloying, and too sweet, like flowers left too long beside a grave. Miss Marple remained still for several moments longer, listening, not for a voice, but for the absence of one. Then, at last she returned inside. She did not mention Clara to Eliza, not yet. Instead, she returned to the attic with a candle and a notepad, and began to cross-reference the names in the great-aunt's journals with the family letters and old photographs stored throughout the house. She wrote for hours, names, dates, symptoms, patterns. Clara was not the first young woman to go missing, nor the second. Every 20 years, almost to the month, someone vanished. A cousin, a niece, a daughter, always a woman, always unmarried, always connected by blood to the Hawthorne line, and each disappearance had been followed, within days, by the most extraordinary blooming of the roses. She flipped back to one of the oldest entries in the journal, and read aloud to herself, "There is no bloom without sacrifice. Roses do not lie, they consume." It was nearly midnight when Miss Marple descended from the attic once more. The hallway below was darker than usual, the sconces left unlit, the distant clock ticking louder than it had earlier in the day. It was not the kind of darkness that pressed against the skin. It was quieter than that. It lingered without weight, like a breath being held by something unseen. She passed the drawing room, on her way to the library, and paused. Inside, Eliza sat by the fire, though no flames flickered in the hearth. She wasn't reading. She wasn't knitting. Her hands lay still on the arms of the chair, fingers curled ever so slightly inward. Her gaze was fixed forward, toward a point on the wall just above the mantel, where a new portrait had been hung sometime in the last week. It was a painting Miss Marple hadn't seen before. A young woman in profile, her face turned just enough that one could not be sure if she was smiling, or simply about to speak. Her dress, a pale green, matched one Miss Marple remembered Clara wearing the week before her disappearance. "Eliza," Miss Marple said gently, stepping inside, "when was that portrait added?" Eliza blinked slowly, as if waking from a thought not her own. "I had it moved from the East Wing. It's always been in the family. I think it was Camilla, my sister, or maybe Aunt Beatrice. They looked so alike as girls. But that dress," Miss Marple said softly, "is Clara's." A silence fell between them, and though no clock struck, no chime rang, it felt as if time had skipped ahead. Eliza turned back to the fireless hearth. "Do you believe the garden knows?" she asked, not looking at her guest. "Do you think it remembers what we plant in it?" Miss Marple sat in the nearby chair. "I think the earth does not forget, it simply waits for us to remember." Eliza smiled faintly, then an expression too tight, to be anything but fear beneath the surface. There was a story I heard as a girl, told in hushed voices by the staff when they thought I was asleep, about Aunt Cordelia, the one who vanished. They said she was last seen in the greenhouse, pruning back a black rose that shouldn't have bloomed that season. And when they found her scissors, weeks later, they were buried under a root that hadn't been there before. Miss Marple waited. They said the rose had changed colour, that it was red when they found it, and that it only bloomed once, for one night. Then never again. And do you believe it? Miss Marple asked. I don't know what I believe anymore, Eliza whispered. Only that Clara's window was locked from the inside, and her shoes were by the bed, but I found rose petals beneath her pillow, dried, as if they'd been there for years. Miss Marple said nothing, because there was nothing left to offer but silence, and questions not yet ready to be asked aloud. She rose then, and went back to the greenhouse. Not in haste, not in fear, but in the way one walks through a place that is not theirs, but remembers their presence all the same. The moon was high now, casting thin beams through the greenhouse glass, distorting the lines of shadow into odd angles across the floor. The plants within, though pruned and still, seemed to lean toward her, hungry, expectant. She approached the trapdoor again, kneeling slowly. She had not opened it since discovering it 2 nights prior. Now she placed her hand to the edge, and paused. There, on the stone beside it, lay a single petal, deep crimson, fresh. But no rose had been cut. She lifted it gently, feeling the moisture still clinging to the curve of its edge. And just as she turned it over in her hand, a breath stirred behind her. She turned. And Clara stood once more, outside the greenhouse glass. This time, there was no motion. This time, there was no mistake. Clara was watching her. But it was not Clara. Not entirely. Something older sat behind her eyes.
Chapter 10. A Ghost in Daylight. Morning at Hawthorne Grange did not rise so much as arrive uninvited. The sun, dim behind a veil of thin grey clouds, filtered weakly through the lace curtains and spilled in uncertain streaks across the faded floorboards of Miss Marple's room. There was a stiffness in the air, not of cold, but of stillness, the kind of hush that followed a night which should not be spoken of, a silence filled not by rest, but by restraint. Miss Marple had barely slept. She had not seen Clara again after that moment in the greenhouse. The girl had vanished as swiftly as she had appeared, her face lingering like an afterimage burned behind the eyes, the stare too long, too steady to belong to someone who should have known her, or anyone at all. There had been no footprints beneath the window where she had stood, no signs of entrance or exit, only that single petal, dark as dried blood, clinging to the inside of the glass. And yet now, as the old clock downstairs struck 9, a sound of movement reached Miss Marple's ears from below, a murmur of voices, the creak of a chair, the unmistakable hush of someone walking barefoot across the hall tiles. Clara was downstairs, alive, present, and sitting at the breakfast table as though she had never been gone. Miss Marple made her way down the staircase slowly, her eyes glancing once again to the portrait in the corridor. The figure, whom they still could not place definitively as Camilla or Beatrice or some long-forgotten cousin, still faced the hearth. But there was something new. The expression had changed. Not obviously, not in the stroke of brush or pigment, but in impression. The woman no longer seemed thoughtful. She seemed to be listening. At the table, Clara sipped weak tea. Her hair had been brushed, though not by her own hand, Miss Marple suspected, for strands clung in odd directions at the back of her head, and her fingers trembled slightly as she held the teacup. Her complexion remained pale, but her lips had a faint flush, as if kissed by some windless cold. She looked up as Miss Marple entered and offered a soft, uncertain smile. "You look well," Miss Marple said gently, her voice balanced between reassurance and inquiry. "I feel tired," Clara said after a pause. "My dreams were strange." Eliza, standing behind her niece, folded her arms. Her gaze flicked toward Miss Marple and away again, unreadable. Miss Marple sat. "Do you remember anything from yesterday?" she asked, watching Clara carefully. Clara blinked, the question seeming to land on her like snowfall, soft, unexpected, but chilling. "Yesterday?" she repeated. "Yes, my dear. Yesterday." Clara stared into her tea. Her fingers began to circle the rim of the cup, not with anxiousness, but with the steady rhythm of someone listening to a song only she could hear. "I was in bed," she said slowly. "I remember the rose scent. It was very strong. And I think I was dreaming of the greenhouse. The old one. There was something inside it." "What did you see?" Eliza asked quickly, stepping forward. Clara hesitated. "I'm not sure. It wasn't clear. It spoke to me." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What did it say?" Clara opened her mouth, and for a moment, no sound came. Then, in a voice not quite her own, slightly lower, slightly slower, touched with a rhythm and accent that did not belong to her, she whispered, "Blood remembers, and it blooms." The air in the room shifted, subtly, and without sound. Eliza took a sharp breath. Clara blinked again, looking around the room as if startled by her own words. "What did I say?" she asked, confused. Miss Marple did not answer, not at first. She stood, walked to the windowsill, and picked up the small leather-bound diary she had brought down from the attic. She opened it to the page she had marked with a faded ribbon the night before. The ink was faded, the hand older, shakier, but the words were clear. "Blood remembers, and it blooms." She turned the diary toward Eliza, who stared at the entry and said nothing. "Eliza," Miss Marple said softly, "has Clara ever spoken in her sleep before?" "Not like this," Eliza said. "Not with other words, and not like someone else was using her mouth." Clara looked from one woman to the other, uncertain. Her hands had gone still. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know what's happening. I feel like I'm waking up from something, but I don't remember going to sleep." Miss Marple closed the diary slowly. "It's not your fault," she said, "but something old is working its way back into this house. And it's speaking through you." There was no reply. The clock struck the half-hour, the sound sharper than usual, and somewhere far above them, from the closed attic door, something creaked. The rest of the day passed in half-shadow. Clara, though awake and seemingly sound of mind, remained unnervingly still. She spoke little, ate less, and when she did rise from her chair, her movements bore the stiff grace of someone half remembering how to be alive. Eliza hovered, not as a guardian, but as someone afraid to break a spell that held her niece together, a tension that if named or acknowledged, might unravel everything. Miss Marple spent much of the day reviewing the older journals, those written in a tighter, neater hand decades before. She was searching now for names, symbols, habits that echoed the voice Clara had used. If something or someone from the past had found a conduit in Clara, it had done so with purpose. It was not possession in the vulgar sense, it was remembrance. A whisper traveling through blood and breath, memory, and root. By mid-afternoon, she found it. In a narrow journal, bound with ribbon and stained with what appeared to be rose sap, there was a passage dated March, 1892, written by a woman identified only as R. It read, "The girl walked the halls last night again. She opened her mouth, and my sister's voice came out. We burned the linens again. The roses are late this year, but the lady's red is opening. I do not think it will close again." The handwriting in the entries after that grew hurried, disjointed. Several pages were torn out, but at the edge of one entry, in the margin, was a single phrase, barely legible. "She walked barefoot in the garden, and spoke the name we buried." Miss Marple set the book down carefully. The phrase repeated itself in her mind, not just for what it said, but for what it did not. The entry did not tell who the girl was, nor the sister, nor the name. That night, the house was quiet again, but the silence did not feel restful. It felt like waiting, and then, sometime after 3, Miss Marple heard it. The faint creak of the back door. She rose, slippered feet soft on the floor. shawl around her shoulders. She moved to the landing, and there, through the tall hallway window, she saw her, Clara, in her nightdress, walking barefoot across the garden lawn, her head tilted slightly, her arms at her sides, her steps slow but steady, moving with purpose, but not her own. Miss Marple descended quickly, but without sound. She opened the back door just enough to step through and followed, keeping a small distance between them. The roses shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and Clara's white gown made her appear as much ghost as girl. She walked through the rose garden, and came to a stop before the lady's red rose, and she began to speak. The voice was Clara's, but altered again, less eerie this time, sad, resigned. She spoke with the cadence of someone much older, her words brittle like dry leaves. She lied, the voice said. She was supposed to stay, but she fled, and so I stayed in her place. I waited. Miss Marple remained still. Clara knelt in the dirt. Her hands did not flinch at the thorns. She reached into the soil, as if she'd done so before, root and bone, blood and bloom. She tilted her head toward the house. She's still here, the one who made the garden. She whispers in the walls. Then Clara stood and turned, eyes wide, not at Miss Marple, but at something beyond her, and she said, in a voice just loud enough to shiver the air, "Cordelia." And with that, she collapsed. Miss Marple ran to her, calling her name, lifting her gently. Clara's eyes fluttered open, and the confusion in them was total. "What happened?" she whispered. "You were sleepwalking," Miss Marple said. "It's all right now, but it wasn't all right, and it hadn't been for a very long time." By morning, Clara had no recollection of the night's events. She awoke with a headache, and a faint stain of soil beneath her fingernails, that she could not explain. She laughed softly when Miss Marple remarked on it, but the sound had a brittle edge, like porcelain lightly tapped, and she spoke more slowly that day, pausing often between words, as though waiting for someone else to speak through her again. Miss Marple spent the hours after breakfast in the library, poring over every genealogical record she could locate. It was no small effort. The Hawthorne family had branches that twisted in every direction, names that repeated, dates that overlapped, and contradicted one another. But after hours of sorting and cross-checking, she found it. In the birth registry for 1874, Cordelia Isadora Hawthorne, second daughter of Reginald and Honoria. No marriage record, no death certificate, just a note in faint pencil. Disappeared. 1892. She matched the date to the diary entry, the barefoot girl in the garden, the borrowed voice, the name they buried. It wasn't metaphor, it was literal. Cordelia had been erased, or tried to be. She brought the journal and registry to Eliza, who was in the conservatory, arranging roses that no longer seemed beautiful. Their color was too heavy. Their scent lingered too long. Miss Marple placed the book on the table before her. "Eliza," she said quietly, "you told me your great-aunt vanished, but I believe she was taken, or buried, or worse, bound." Eliza did not respond. Miss Marple opened the diary to the marked page, and tapped the word, "Cordelia." Eliza's fingers tightened around the vase. "You don't understand," she whispered. "She was not right. She spoke in her sleep. She wandered. She kept journals. Said the garden listened. That the house remembered her. My mother used to lock her in the west wing during full moons when she started humming to herself." "She was locked away?" Miss Marple asked. "She was protected," Eliza replied, but the words rang hollow. Miss Marple said nothing more. She gathered her materials, and left Eliza alone with the roses. That evening, she found a new diary. One not stored in the attic, but tucked behind a false panel in the bookshelf. It was older, smaller, and written in Cordelia's own hand. The writing began neat, poetic even, but grew frantic in the final pages. One entry stood alone. "The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. They'll plant me with the bones if I speak, but I must. It's not the poison in the soil that twists the roots, it's the lie in the name." That night, Miss Marple walked the halls, and found Clara standing again at the portrait, barefoot, eyes closed, murmuring something too soft to hear, and for just a moment, The reflection in the glass was not Clara's, it was Cordelia's. Chapter 11. Portraits of the Dead. In the days that followed Clara's second sleepwalking episode, the house seemed to quiet, but not in peace. The air grew heavier somehow, as if the walls had inhaled and never exhaled, holding something ancient and unspoken just behind the wallpaper. Conversations were shorter, footsteps quieter. Even the clocks seemed less certain of the time they marked. Miss Marple knew better than to mistake calm for resolution. Something was building, gathering not only in the garden soil or in Clara's troubled sleep, but in the rooms themselves, in the way the house watched her. Yes, watched. That was the only word for it. Not all at once, and not with malice, but with a quiet curiosity, as if the place itself was remembering something she had not yet discovered. And so, one rain-laced afternoon, she turned her attention to the one part of Hawthorne Grange she had long avoided, the portrait hall. The hall had once been a gallery, built in the late 1700s to display the lineage of the Hawthorne estate, each face captured in oil with stern dignity or soft elegance, depending on the fashion of the era. There were about 30 portraits altogether, spanning 5 generations, some ornate and regal, others faded into the canvas, as if the paint itself regretted having been applied. Yet it wasn't the faces themselves that had drawn her down the long corridor. It was the roses. She'd noticed it during an earlier passing, half distracted, perhaps even skeptical of her own perception. But now she was sure. Several of the portraits, particularly those of the women, featured roses painted subtly into the background. Some were held in gloved hands, others rested in a vase nearby. One was pinned to a collar, but more curious still, each was painted with extraordinary detail, far more vivid than the rest of the image. The petals so finely rendered they seemed to pulse softly in the light. And there was something else. She stood before the portrait of Lydia Hawthorne, dated 1843. The woman sat with gloved hands clasped at her lap, a single white rose resting on the crook of her wrist. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, her smile polite, but distant. Miss Marple leaned in. She counted 5 roses in the vase behind her. She opened her notebook and jotted the detail down. Next was Annabel Hawthorne, painted 1867. Her figure turned slightly to the left. In the background, just beyond a window, a garden scene. Again 5 roses, red this time, near the lower right corner. Again Miss Marple recorded it. Then Beatrice, 1889, 3 roses. Then Camilla, 1909, 2. And finally, the most recent of them all, a painting so recent that the oil still held its faint chemical gloss, Clara. Only it wasn't labelled. It hung at the end of the hall without frame or plaque. The canvas was stretched, the edges raw, and the face was not entirely finished. Miss Marple stepped closer. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was Clara, but not as she appeared now. The figure in the painting looked older, warier, as if she'd lived through something already, and was only now surfacing again. The background was a haze of half-finished strokes, shadows without definition, light without source. But in the lower corner, emerging with startling clarity from a patch of shadow, was a rose bush. 6 blooms. Miss Marple's breath caught. She turned back to Camilla's portrait. 2. Beatrice. 3. Annabel. 5. And Lydia. 5 again. Clara. 6. 6 roses. She looked again at Clara's unfinished face. The artist, clearly had known her intimately, had painted with an eye, not just for likeness, but for legacy. And yet, Clara had never sat for a portrait. Not since arriving at the Grange. She stepped back, gaze shifting to the far corner of the gallery. There stood an old cheval mirror, tall and streaked with age. It had been turned to the wall. Miss Marple adjusted it carefully. The angle caught the entire hall, and in the reflection for just an instant, she saw a figure behind her, tall, thin, standing at the far end, half cloaked in shadow. But when she turned, the space was empty. She stared into the mirror once more. The figure was gone, but the air behind her was colder now, much colder. Miss Marple stood for some time in the cold gallery, after the figure in the mirror vanished, not because she expected it to return, but because she needed to think clearly before she took her next step. The portraits were no longer simply paintings, they were a pattern, and patterns, in her experience, often proved more truthful than people. She made her way to the East Wing, once the private quarters of Eliza's father, Edwin Hawthorne, a reclusive man, even by family standards. According to what little Eliza had shared, he had been an artist by obsession more than trade. He painted only family, never commissions, and he had disappeared shortly after Clara's birth, leaving behind a locked room, a half-finished canvas, and a silence no one was allowed to disturb. Miss Marple suspected the silence had not only remained, but thickened. The door to Edwin's study was stiff with age, the brass handle tarnished, the key long gone, but age had its kindness. The frame had shifted enough with time that a single firm push was all it took to break the seal. The room smelled of old turpentine and damp linen. Light filtered in through a curtain that hadn't been drawn in years. A canvas sat on the easel, covered with a grey cloth. The desk beside it was cluttered with cracked paint jars, loose sketches, and a half-open drawer filled with unmailed letters, most addressed to someone simply titled, "My Beloved Girl." Miss Marple opened the drawer further. Inside, a bundle of envelopes tied with twine, some dated 2 decades past, others more recent, though the handwriting deteriorated over time. Trembling, as if written in pain or haste, she untied the string carefully and read the top letter. "I saw her again, not as she is, but as she was before, when the garden still whispered, not screamed. She wears the same face. I don't know who she belongs to anymore." Beneath it, another, "The portrait refuses to stay finished. Every night, I paint her, and every morning the canvas changes. A rose appears, a hand turns inward, her mouth closes again. I've stopped naming the brushes, I've stopped sleeping." Miss Marple turned to the covered painting. She hesitated only a moment before pulling the cloth free. "Clara." Again. But this time, the likeness was complete, exhaustingly detailed, right down to the creases near her eyes, the barely there scar on her chin. Her gaze was hauntingly direct, as though Edwin had painted not from life, but from some terrifying memory he could not forget. And around her, curling like smoke or roots or both, were roses, 7 now, one more than in the portrait hanging in the hallway. Miss Marple stepped closer. This was not a portrait of a girl, it was a warning. She returned to the letters. One near the bottom, barely legible now, bore no date. "If she finds this, if you find this, you must stop her. The garden only takes what it thinks is owed, but it does not forgive. It remembers every brushstroke, every silence." She folded the letters and placed them gently in her bag. Back in the hall, the painting of Clara remained unchanged. But now, Miss Marple counted again. The roses, 7. Just as in the one Edwin left behind. She pulled out her earlier notes. It had been 6, now it was 7. And Clara had not been in the garden today. Something else had. Evening descended with quiet weight. The wind pressed faintly against the windows, but brought no rain, only the kind of stillness that makes the house feel older, more alert, as if it too were pausing to listen. Miss Marple waited until the last of the lamplight faded from the west side of the house before seeking out Eliza in the blue sitting room, the one where Eliza rarely allowed guests, and where a small landscape of the rose garden always hung askew, as though it had shifted on its own. Eliza sat by the fire, though no book lay open in her lap. "You've been in his room," she said, not turning as Miss Marple entered. "I have. You found the letters." "I did." Silence settled between them. "He stopped painting me when I was 16, Eliza said after a long pause. "He said I was too much like her, too much like the one he lost. He started painting from memory instead, not of us, but of something else, someone else. At first I thought it was Camilla, or our grandmother, but it wasn't." She turned, her eyes tired. "It was the garden," she said. "He was painting what the garden remembered." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Clara, she looks like her, more every day, but it's not just resemblance. It's weight. She carries something, as if the portrait was inside her before he ever touched a brush." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on the mantel. "He knew what was happening. He tried to warn someone. He vanished before I could ask him what." Eliza whispered. "I came home one day, and the door was locked. The key was gone. There were roses on the stair, and that canvas, the first version, was leaning outside the room, unfinished, just the shape of a girl, and 7 red petals at her feet. And Clara wasn't born yet. She was born 3 weeks later." Neither woman spoke. Later that night, Miss Marple heard a sound, a creak, a whisper of linen, a hush of movement down the hallway. She rose from her chair, the candle in her hand barely flickering as she made her way to the portrait gallery. The door was already ajar. Clara stood in front of her own image. Her hands were folded before her. Her hair, loose around her shoulders, looked damp, as though she had just returned from the garden, though her feet were dry, and her gown untouched by soil. She was whispering something. Miss Marple drew close enough to hear, one word, again and again. Not her own name, but one long forgotten. Cordelia. As the candlelight danced along the wall, Miss Marple turned to the portrait again. The roses. Now there were 8.
Chapter 12. Eliza's secret. There are silences that wait patiently for words to catch up, and there are others that grow heavier with every heartbeat, laced not with anticipation, but with the weight of what has already been known, already buried and left unspoken for too long. The silence that lay between Miss Marple and Eliza Hawthorne now was of the latter kind. The morning light found them seated in the drawing room. The fire had gone out some time before dawn, but neither woman moved to relight it. The shadows it left behind seemed to settle into the upholstery and along the ridged spines of books, as if trying to reclaim corners of the house not meant to be exposed in daylight. Clara had not come down, or if she had, she'd returned to her room before either of them stirred. Miss Marple held the old letters now, the ones written by Edwin Hawthorne, Eliza's father, the final page still open before her, the lines trembling across the paper, as though the man who wrote them had known he was racing something he could not outrun. She placed them down on the low table between them. "Eliza," she said softly, "you've known for some time that Clara was not the first." Eliza did not look up. She sat rigidly in the high-backed chair near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders drawn inward, not as if hiding, but containing, as though something had long lived inside her, and she had grown accustomed to holding it in place by sheer force of will. "I suspected," she replied, her voice quiet and flat. "But I did not know, not all of it. You knew about the garden." "Yes, and the remains beneath it." A pause. "Yes." Miss Marple did not flinch, nor raise her voice. "How long?" Eliza finally looked up. "I was 16, she said. "The year before my mother died." The fire crackled softly then, though no flame had been lit. "She took me into the greenhouse one night, said we were to tend to the old roots. I didn't understand. She showed me how to kneel, how to press the soil with my hands. There was a pattern to it, the way you dig, the rhythm. It wasn't about planting, it was about calling. She told me that the soil remembers, and that sometimes it needs to be reminded." Miss Marple waited. "She dug only a little," Eliza continued, "and I saw something white, at first. Smooth. I thought it was a stone. But it wasn't. It was a knuckle, a finger." Her voice cracked at the edges now, not with emotion, but exhaustion. "She said it had to stay buried, that it had been done out of love, that it was what the garden needed." "Your mother said that?" "Yes. She said it had to be her, that the garden demanded a gift, or it would start taking on its own. She said it had chosen her, and if she obeyed, it would stop. But it didn't," Miss Marple said. "No." Eliza stared at the cold hearth. "It never stops. It remembers." Miss Marple leaned back. Eliza, who was buried there. There was a long drawn breath. "My aunt," she whispered. "Cordelia." The name hung in the air like incense, old, clinging, ceremonial. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And your mother, was she the one who she said she didn't do it?" "That Cordelia gave herself, willingly." Eliza swallowed. "But I never believed her, and I never asked again. And now, Clara. She looks like her." Eliza's voice faltered for the first time, and not just in the face. In the way she walks the house, in how she dreams. It's like the garden has reached out and pulled something back into her. Or maybe it never left. Miss Marple took the old diary from her satchel and laid it open to a familiar page. "The rose must bloom with memory. If the name is forgotten, it comes again. In flesh, if not in voice." "Eliza, why keep the portraits?"
she asked. Because they're warnings, Eliza said. Every rose in the canvas, every change, it's part of it. Each woman in our line, marked by that garden, ends up painted, even if they never sat for it. My father said they came to him in dreams, that the canvas pulled them from the soil. And you believed him. I do now. A gust of wind rattled the far window pane, and both women turned their heads in unison, neither startled, only alert, as though the sound had confirmed something already half expected. Eliza, Miss Marple said softly. There's more, isn't there? Eliza's jaw clenched, and she nodded slowly, her voice low and deliberate. There's something in the garden, she said. A presence. My mother called it the Watcher. The Watcher, Eliza repeated, the name resting heavily on her tongue. Not like an invention, but a truth that had lost its place in conversation, and taken root in memory instead. She said it always comes before the garden chooses. It doesn't speak, and it doesn't move. It simply watches, and if you see it, it means something has been remembered. Miss Marple kept her expression composed, though the air in the room felt cooler now, as if the fire that had never been lit had drawn warmth into itself. The Watcher, the word had no fixed shape, and yet it conjured an immediate sense of being seen by something far older than the house. I was 9 the first time, Eliza continued, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It was early morning. I had gone out to feed the birds, and walked too far into the rose garden. There was frost on the petals, and a low mist had settled, and I saw it, just beyond the lady's red, a figure, tall, dressed in what looked like morning black. No face I could make out, but I remember the tilt of the head. Not toward me, toward the earth, as if it were listening to something beneath the ground. Miss Marple listened without interrupting. I ran, of course, Eliza said. And when I told my mother, she didn't ask what I'd seen. She only asked where. When I told her, she went very still. And then she told me never to go to that part of the garden again, unless I was prepared to give something in return. And did you? Miss Marple asked. Once, Eliza said. By accident, I buried a bird there. One I found injured near the hedgerow. I didn't tell anyone. I just thought it was the right thing to do. She fell quiet. And the next morning, she added, the bush that hadn't bloomed all year was in full flower. 13 roses, all deep red. Miss Marple stood slowly, and walked to the window. The garden was barely visible through the fog, its shape discernible only by the faintest outlines. But she didn't need to see it. She could feel it, the same way one felt a room change when someone enters silently. Eliza, she said after a long silence. You've told me about Cordelia, about your mother, but not yourself. Why stay here? Why not leave? Eliza smiled faintly, without mirth. Because leaving doesn't work. The ones who left, they still appear in the portraits. The ones who forgot the names, they're the ones the Watcher comes for. And Clara, she was never meant to be here this long, Eliza whispered. She came only for the summer, but the moment she stepped into the greenhouse, the garden remembered her. Or someone through her. Miss Marple turned, her gaze settling on the mirror above the sideboard. It was one of the few in the house, not covered by cloth, or turned to face the wall. The frame was carved with vines, too delicately rendered to be accidental, winding roses etched into every curve. She stepped toward it, tilting her head, studying not her own reflection, but what lay beyond her. Just faintly, in the corner of the mirror, near the doorway, a shift, a suggestion of a figure, a narrow silhouette, unmoving, not outside the house, not behind her in the room, but reflected just the same. Miss Marple did not turn, she simply looked. The figure did not vanish. It remained for 3 heartbeats longer, then gone. She looked to Eliza. Eliza hadn't moved. I saw it, Miss Marple said. Eliza nodded. So did I. That night, the rain returned, not in sheets, but as a steady whisper against the old windows, as though the sky itself had decided not to pour but to murmur. The kind of weather that did not cleanse, but revealed. The corridors of Hawthorne Grange felt longer in that hush. The candlelight seemed to crawl along the woodwork, rather than illuminate it. Miss Marple sat in her guest room, the journal open beside her, notes spread across the writing desk, like petals pressed flat between the pages of a life. She reread the passage again. The watcher is not summoned. It waits. It remembers. It does not ask questions, because it already knows the answers. It only wants you to speak them aloud. Down the hall, Clara stirred in her sleep. Eliza had asked to sit with her, had insisted, in fact, though she did not speak the reason. Miss Marple had not argued. Some reckonings required private stages, but sometime after midnight, the silence was pierced. It was not a cry, not a scream, but a voice. Clara's, rising in pitch slowly, speaking words not hers. "Eliza, you broke it," she murmured, though her tone was not angry. "You left it alone, and it grew. You left it hungry." Miss Marple opened her door. Eliza stood already in the hallway, pale as the wall behind her, eyes fixed on Clara's open doorway. The girl lay in her bed, hair splayed on the pillow like a dark halo, eyes closed, but mouth moving. "She always said she'd come back," Clara whispered, "not to forgive, just to remind." Eliza entered first, kneeling beside her niece's bed, brushing a trembling hand against Clara's wrist. "Cordelia," Clara said again, softer now. "Cordelia," and then, in a voice that could not have been Clara's, a final phrase, "It was you." Clara's eyes snapped open. She looked directly at Eliza, and said nothing more. The silence returned, but it was no longer still. It watched. Later, in the small hours when dawn threatened, but had not yet breached the trees, Miss Marple sat once more with Eliza in the sitting room, the fire now lit, though it provided little comfort. Eliza spoke without prompting. "There was a second burial," she said. "Not in the garden." Miss Marple waited. "My mother never told me the full truth about Cordelia, but I overheard them once, her and my father, arguing near the cellar. She said something had to be hidden, that even memory can rot if left too long. That's what she said." "You went looking," Miss Marple said gently. "I found the bones in the passage beneath the greenhouse. He must have moved her there, and you never told anyone." "I was 14. What would I say? That my family gardened with ghosts?" Miss Marple said nothing. Instead she stood and walked once more to the mirror, the one where the watcher had appeared, and this time, she brought a candle close. The flame flickered, not with wind, but as though something behind the glass had exhaled. The surface trembled faintly, and then it shifted, only slightly, but enough. There it was, a face. For a moment only, a woman's face, hair dark, eyes black, unsmiling, watching, and then it was gone. Eliza's voice was small behind her. "I think it's always been her, not a ghost, not a myth, just Cordelia, remembered, returned." Miss Marple turned. "The garden never wanted blood," she said. "It wanted memory, and no one wanted to remember her." Eliza said nothing. The candlelight flickered again, and in the mirror, just for a second, the watcher stood once more, only this time, she was smiling. Chapter 13. The Riddle of the Roses. There was no formal gathering, no bell to call them in, no summons to draw them down the staircase and into the east drawing room, where the walls leaned in just slightly, and the windows dulled the outside light. And yet, somehow, they all arrived. Eliza, pale but composed, her spine stiff with the posture of someone who has practiced holding herself together for years. Clara, silent and watchful, hands folded in her lap, her gaze flickering to nothing in particular, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Hawthorne, who had long stopped pretending not to listen at doors. Even the air had settled in to watch. Miss Marple stood beside the hearth. There was no fire, only the hollow where flame had once lived, and soot too stubborn to be scrubbed away. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of the moment filled the room more completely than sound ever could. She began, not with accusation, but with structure, with the garden. "I first noticed the inconsistency in the rose blooms," she said. "Not because of their beauty, but because of their insistence. They bloomed out of season, and more than that, they bloomed in reaction. After Clara vanished, the lady's red exploded with colour. After the portrait shifted, another blossom appeared. Flowers don't behave like that. Not unless something beneath the soil is speaking to them. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest. The scent, Miss Marple continued, is a mixture of natural growth and something prepared. Belladonna, yes, but also ash. Alkaline ash, which means something burned, is being mixed into the root soil regularly. Eliza inhaled, but said nothing. I found Cordelia's bones, Miss Marple said. Your father moved them, likely to protect them, to confuse whatever logic the garden obeys. But the roses found her again. They always do. The housekeeper shifted in her seat. That's not possible, she muttered. It's not about what's possible, Miss Marple replied, but what's remembered. She turned to Clara then, and then there was you. Clara met her gaze without blinking. You said you couldn't remember the night you disappeared, that you woke with soil under your nails, that the dreams were confusing, but it wasn't confusion, it was contradiction, because the Clara I met on my first day here had a scar on her left hand from a childhood fall. She told me about it over tea, without hesitation. The Clara I met 2 nights ago does not. The skin is unbroken, the room stilled, even the wind outside fell away. She also hums in her sleep, Miss Marple added. A tune I later found, noted in Cordelia's diary, and she paints roses in the margins of her letters, exactly 7, every time. Clara looked down at her hands. They were trembling now. She came back, she said quietly. Who? Eliza asked, breath catching. Clara, Miss Marple asked gently, but the girl only shook her head. Not no, not yes, just away from the name. And then she smiled, the wrong kind of smile. Too calm, too patient, too much like someone waiting for the room to catch up. Miss Marple did not raise her voice, nor lean forward to confront. She only moved to the small writing table near the wall, an antique thing that once belonged to Eliza's grandfather, and opened a modest leather folio she had brought down from her room. Inside were clippings, dates, envelopes, and something more mundane than any ghost story could match, a receipt. This was mailed from the village grocer, she said, 2 weeks before Clara's supposed disappearance. A parcel ordered in her name, but delivered to the train station, not the house, and signed, not Clara Hawthorne, but C. Bellamy. Eliza sat forward. She never used that name, that was her mother's. Indeed, said Miss Marple. But someone remembered, someone who'd used it before, perhaps when travelling, perhaps when planning to leave. She unfolded another piece of paper, a train schedule with notations in Clara's handwriting, written in the margin of one of her journals, a single line. If I get out before the frost, I'll be safe. Eliza's hand went to her mouth. No, she whispered. There's more, Miss Marple said gently. Your maid, Agnes, told me she helped Clara pack a bag, that Clara told her she was going for only a few days, but not to say anything. Agnes thought it was a romantic elopement. But when Clara didn't come back, she thought better of mentioning it. She said nothing, Eliza repeated. She thought she was protecting Clara's secret, but what she didn't know was that Clara never made it to London. Her ticket was unused. She never boarded the train. Miss Marple paused, turning now to Clara. The girl who looked like her, sounded like her, remembered too much and too little. She never came back. The figure on the couch said nothing. Her expression had gone blank, serene even, as though the moment had slipped past her. Eliza stood now, slowly, as if fighting the shape of something she did not want to admit. I saw her, she said. She was here, I talked to her. But when? Miss Marple asked. Think carefully. Was it the day after she left? A week later? Eliza's eyes darted side to side, memory rearranging itself. There was a storm, she said. That night, she came in through the garden entrance. Her dress was damp. She said she'd changed her mind. Miss Marple waited. Eliza continued, quieter now. But she didn't eat anything that night, and her hands were cold, and she called me Eliza's. No one's called me that since Cordelia. She sat slowly. I didn't want to believe it, she said. But something in her eyes. It was too old, too quiet. Not frightened, just watching. Miss Marple closed the folio gently. Clara never came back. Eliza, the girl who walked into this house, looked like her, moved like her, but she remembers things she never lived. The figure on the couch turned now, slowly, deliberately. She spoke softly. Clara wasn't strong enough. The voice was not unkind, but it was not Clara's. The room was silent now, but it was not empty. There was a presence in the stillness, not seen but deeply felt, a weight that pressed behind the ears, settled in the chest, whispered down the spine. The watcher was not standing in the mirror, but it was in the room, its memory, its intent, its gaze. It had always been here. Miss Marple, still beside the hearth, kept her voice measured. "Who are you?" she asked. The girl tilted her head slightly. The gesture was too smooth, too rehearsed. The kind of movement practiced in another time. She stood now, her nightdress brushing the edge of the rug, and turned toward the portrait on the wall, the one that had changed, subtly but unmistakably, over the past weeks. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. "I remember the taste of ash," she said, not quite to anyone. "I remember soil that sang when the rain touched it. I remember names whispered into root systems. I remember not being chosen." Eliza rose, trembling now, her voice thin. "What did you do to her?" The girl turned. "I didn't take her. She left a door open, and I stepped through." A gust rattled the high windows. Miss Marple took a slow step forward. "And Cordelia?" The girl nodded once. "She was buried, yes, but not lost. And I was not the only one who remembered her. Your father did. The garden did. And Clara." She tried to forget. She paused, the light from the hallway, now casting long shadows into the room. But forgetting doesn't save you. Only remembering does. Miss Marple looked toward the mirror once more. The watcher was there again. But this time, she stood not behind Clara, but behind Eliza. Miss Marple did not speak. She only turned to Eliza, and waited. Eliza's voice, when it came, was nearly inaudible. "I saw her," she said. "That day in the greenhouse. Clara had run outside. She said she wanted to take one last look before leaving. I followed, but I couldn't find her. Only her scarf. Caught on the door latch." She swallowed. "And then I saw the rose blooming. Just one. The lady's red, before the frost." Miss Marple stepped to the girl. "You're not her," she said. The girl smiled. "No, but I remember her." She turned back toward the window. In her reflection now, something was wrong. She cast no shadow, and then a whisper from the roses outside, a rustle from the greenhouse path. And behind Miss Marple, in the mirror's cold glass, the watcher leaned in closer, just for a second. Chapter 14. The Woman in the Garden. By morning, the house felt different, not emptier. Hawthorne Grange was never empty, but quieter, as though some long-held breath had finally exhaled through the rafters. The air no longer creaked, the floorboards no longer groaned. The walls didn't seem to press in quite so tightly around their occupants, but the silence that followed was not relief. It was what came after confession, after exposure, what lingered in the stillness after truth had shifted shape and no longer wore familiar faces. Clara, or the woman who looked like Clara, had not slept. She stood by the window of the north-facing guest room, watching the garden below, without speaking, without blinking for long stretches of time. Eliza had gone to her room, closed the door softly, and had not emerged since the firelight died. And Miss Marple, who understood the value of patience better than most, waited, not idly, but purposefully. She walked the gallery again. She reread the journals. She revisited the greenhouse floor and its trapdoor, now sealed shut beneath layers of carefully compacted soil and fresh petals. And then, sometime near dusk, she found herself in the portrait corridor once more, drawn there not by curiosity, but by obligation. The hallway was dimmer than she remembered, the overhead bulb still flickering after days of inattention. The faces on the walls seemed to flicker too. No, not move, but shift, as if the memories behind their eyes had rearranged themselves in the night. Lydia, Annabel, Camilla, Beatrice. Each one wore that familiar expression, restrained grace, eyes fixed at some midpoint beyond the viewer, mouths closed in a half-smile that looked neither kind nor cruel, but enduring. Until now. Now they all smiled. Fully, too fully. The lips curled just slightly higher. The eyes glinted, not with joy, but with knowledge. Not a warmth, but a recognition. A shared secret, once buried in soil, now blooming behind painted glass. Except one. Miss Marple stopped in front of the final portrait, the canvas that had, until now, shown Clara's unfinished likeness. The girl in the portrait was gone. The rose garden in the background remained, now overgrown, and richer in colour than ever before, but the figure had vanished entirely. Not erased, not painted over, blank, as though the person who once stood there had been released. Miss Marple did not flinch. She closed her notebook and walked away. Downstairs, the drawing room was empty. Eliza's chair was pulled back slightly. There was no cup of tea, no blanket, no book open and waiting to be resumed. Only a single red rose, stained dark. Miss Marple stepped forward. Not just red, spotted. At the base of the bloom, near the stem, was a patch of drying blood. Miss Marple did not call out for Eliza. She did not search the house, nor the cellar, nor the eastern study, where Eliza sometimes wandered when sleep was elusive. She had no need to. The rose on the chair told her what had happened, or at least what had begun. The rest would be found where it always had been, not in the walls of the house, but in the ground around it, beneath it. She returned to the garden. The air outside was colder than expected, still, too still for late afternoon. The leaves along the hedgerows had stopped rustling, not from lack of wind, but as though listening. The pathway to the lady's red was soft beneath her shoes. No prints, though she knew it had been walked that day, perhaps only minutes before. The rosebush stood taller than she remembered, its blooms wider, fuller, and there, nestled in the soil, beneath the largest root, freshly disturbed earth, a square of pale cloth, torn lace, and beneath it, something darker. She crouched, brushed the soil aside, slowly, carefully, revealing not a body, not yet, but a chain, thin, silver, broken at one end. A locket. She wiped the dirt from its surface, opened it. Inside, two portraits. One of Eliza, as a child, one of Cordelia. And behind them, tucked deep into the velvet lining of the locket's case, pressed so flat it had been almost part of the metal, was a single word, scratched in with something sharp. I remember. She stood. Across the garden, the greenhouse waited, its frame trembling faintly in the breeze, the glass fogged at the edges, as if breath had been exhaled from within. She moved toward it. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The air was thicker, warmer, the scent of roses was overwhelming now, but not sweet, damp, earthy, tinged with something older. A root cellar in summer. A crypt. She stepped to the center. There, just beside the trapdoor, stood Clara. Her eyes were closed, her hands at her sides, and her lips moved, not soundlessly. Not this time. Miss Marple stood silently as the girl spoke. She said it would only take the ones forgotten, the ones unloved, but that's not how memory works. You can't erase someone with silence, you make them louder. Her eyes opened, and for just a moment, only a moment, they weren't Clara's. They were older, darker, and they looked through Miss Marple. They buried us, and planted roses. Her smile was thin, not cruel, not kind, just tired. For several heartbeats, nothing moved. Clara, if it was still Clara, stood beneath the hanging vines of the greenhouse roof, her bare feet half hidden in the moss between flagstones. The air shifted once, just enough for the glass panes to hum gently in their frame. Miss Marple, still by the threshold, took a single step forward. "You remember," she said softly. Clara tilted her head. "I was never allowed to forget." She reached toward the base of the old rose trunk, the one nearest the door, thickest of them all, its bark hardened over decades. From the soil beneath it, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. Without hesitation, she offered it to Miss Marple. Inside, bones, small, delicate, childlike, and resting atop them, preserved somehow within the cloth, a dried bloom, not red, but white. "I was the first," Clara whispered, "before Cordelia, before Beatrice, before they learned to do it quietly." She did not weep, nor did she tremble. Her voice had become distant again, aged hollow, like water echoing from a deep well. "They said I died of fever, but I didn't. I just stopped being theirs, and so they gave me to the garden, and the garden grew." Miss Marple closed the cloth gently. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. She looked up, but Clara was gone. The greenhouse door stood ajar once more, the air behind her cold again. She stepped out, and made her way slowly, deliberately, back to the house, through the garden path, past the ivy-grown well, past the yew hedge, where the initials of forgotten cousins had been carved and weathered into nothing. Inside, the hallway was waiting, and so were the portraits. She walked them once more, and now each woman smiled, broadly, too broadly. Painted eyes followed her progress, as though the canvas had softened to breath, but one portrait had changed again. The final canvas, the one that had once held Clara's unfinished likeness, was now blank, completely. Except for a shadow, a single figure, faint, head bowed, standing in a garden, hands empty, not Clara, not Cordelia, not anyone known. Miss Marple leaned closer, and as the candlelight passed over the canvas, she saw it. On the ground at the figure's feet, roses, not painted, real, pressed into the canvas itself, and beneath them, something else, a name, only half visible, L. The rest had been scraped away. Miss Marple stepped back. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her.
Chapter 15. The garden remembers. It had always been that way, ever since Miss Marple had first visited the countryside. As a younger woman, trains in rural England did not arrive or depart by schedule, but rather by temperament, as though the land itself dictated when it was time to move on. And so she stood, gloved hands resting lightly on the handle of her small travel case, watching the thin mist curl above the hedgerows lining the outer lane. The platform was empty. No porters, no waiting passengers, only the distant call of a wood pigeon and the soft rustling of leaves that had turned brittle too early in the season. She had left Hawthorne Grange only an hour earlier. No one had seen her out. There had been no farewell in the drawing room, no final tea by the hearth. Eliza's chair had remained empty. Clara, if she could still be called that, had been nowhere to be found. And the house, so long filled with quiet breath and watching mirrors, had finally grown truly still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come with peace, but with surrender. She had walked alone through the rose garden one last time. It was not as she had first found it. The gardener, Mrs. Crowthorne's nephew, brought up from the village after the last man fell ill, had been ordered to cut the rose bushes down to the roots. Every last one. His hands had trembled at the task. The soil had pushed back. The thorns had clung longer than they should have, but the deed had been done. A dozen rose bushes, each with their own lineage of memory, gone. The soil left raw, open, as if exhaling after a long-held breath. Except for one, the lady's red, the oldest bush, the one with the roots that moved sideways instead of down. They had tried to cut it, yes, but the shears had snapped. The second pair dulled, and when they dug, the earth closed back in, as though disturbed muscle tightening over old bone. Miss Marple had not stopped them, but she had not stayed to watch. As she had passed the garden gate, her eyes drifted to the base of the surviving rose, and there it was, new growth. Overnight. A single shoot, dark green, already bearing thorns, rising upward with unnatural speed. And at its tip, a bud, tight, red, damp at the edges, as though already weeping. She had not touched it.
She had simply walked on. Now, as the train hissed in the distance, Miss Marple did not turn toward the sound. Instead, she opened her notebook for the last time, staring at the final entry she had written in the hours before dawn. It is not the forgetting that undoes us. It is the remembering too late. She closed the book, slipped it into her coat, and as the train came to rest along the platform, and the conductor tipped his cap, she stepped aboard. Behind her, miles away at the edge of the moor, Hawthorne Grange stood beneath the fog. And in its garden, something had begun to grow again. Long after the train had disappeared behind the hills, and Miss Marple's silhouette became just another forgotten shadow among the trees, Hawthorne Grange remained. It had always remained. The house was not grand, not in the way that great halls or castles were. It did not rise with arrogance, nor shine with the pride of clean windows and polished silver. It had always been a quiet house, but not a humble one. There are homes that endure through stillness, and this was one of them. And now, for the first time in years, it exhaled. Floorboards, long taut with the tension of listening, gave a slow groan, like muscles finally stretching. Doors no longer pushed open by unseen hands, sat with their hinges at rest. Even the mirrors, turned now toward the walls by Mrs. Crowthorne's instruction, reflected only their own dust and their own dark. But the memory of those who had lived here, who had walked these halls, and spoken names aloud, they later tried to forget, lingered like perfume soaked into velvet. In the upstairs west corridor, where Cordelia once kept her journals, the scent of rose oil still drifted faintly from behind the closed wardrobe. In the attic, where Eliza had hidden her father's final sketches, the paper had begun to curl from damp, but the lines remained. Even the abandoned locket, left at the base of the greenhouse path, shone faintly when the clouds parted, like a buried coin catching moonlight. And in the drawing room, where the portraits hung, there had been one change more. The figures in the paintings no longer smiled broadly. They had relaxed, their expressions softened, save for one. The final portrait, once blank, now bore the faintest outline of a face. Not a full figure, not even a clear sketch. Just the impression of someone standing there, as if the canvas remembered the pressure of a presence long removed, and the brush had begun, quietly, to fill her in. Not Eliza, not Clara, not even Cordelia, but someone deeper, someone older. The first, the one buried before records were kept, before roses grew by name. Downstairs, the greenhouse door, long closed, shifted. Its latch lifted gently, though no hand moved it. The frame creaked. The door opened, and stayed open. The train moved steadily through the countryside, past fields brushed with frost, past hedgerows stitched with silence. Miss Marple sat by the window, her gloved hands resting neatly on her lap, her gaze unfixed, not on the passing landscape, but on the space between thoughts. She had not spoken since the train departed. There were no more questions to ask. And the answers she had gathered, though methodically stitched and logically sorted, were not meant for reports or testimonies. Some stories remain too soft for newspapers, too heavy for paper. Some truths are only ever whispered between generations, pressed into the soil, left to bloom in silence. She reached into her coat pocket, removed the dried rose petal she had folded into tissue. It was from the lady's red, the last bloom she'd touched before leaving the garden. Its color, once vibrant, had faded to rust, but its edges held, and on the very tip of one petal, a smear, not quite dirt, not quite ink, something remembered. She tucked it into the back of her notebook, and closed it. The memory would stay with her not as something explained, but as something understood. Hawthorne Grange would continue. It always had, and the garden would grow again, not because it had been spared, but because it had been seen. Somewhere behind the hedgerows of memory, something old would always be watching, not with menace, but with the patience of the forgotten. And as the sun dipped below the hills behind the house, back at the edge of the garden path, the greenhouse door remained open, its hinges still, its frame still leaning slightly to one side, and just inside the glass, caught not by the eye, but only by reflection, there stood a figure, barefoot, hair unbound,
not moving, just watching, always watching.